The Pacific is unusually calm, its surface broken only by the slow mechanical rhythm of landing craft advancing toward shore. Gray light spreads across the horizon, revealing an island that looks small, almost insignificant. Then the details emerge. Jagged volcanic ridges, a dark cone rising from the south, black sand beaches that seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside the boats, U.S. Marines sit shoulder to shoulder, packs heavy, rifles clutched close. Faces are still, not calm, controlled. The air smells of fuel, salt, and something sharper, sulfur drifting from the island ahead. Naval guns have been pounding Iwo Jima for days, yet the shore is silent now, too silent. When the ramps drop, boots hit sand that gives way under every step. The ground does not hold. It swallows men to their ankles, then their calves. Movement slows instantly. There is no cover, no tree line, no rise in the land. For a brief moment, some believe the bombardment worked. Then the island opens fire. Machine guns erupt from hidden mouths. Mortars arc unseen through the air. The sand explodes upward in violent bursts. Men fall before they can run. Others keep moving because stopping is death. In these first minutes, it becomes clear, this will not be a battle of speed or maneuver. It will be a battle of endurance, paid for inch by inch. To understand why this island demanded such a price, we must look beyond its shores to a war closing in on Japan itself. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most violent phase. What had begun in December 1941 as a lightning campaign across Southeast Asia and the Pacific had been steadily reversed. One island at a time, American forces had pushed westward, shrinking the Japanese defensive perimeter and bringing the war closer to the home islands. This strategy, later known as island hopping, was not about taking every piece of land. It was about seizing only those positions that mattered most, while isolating and bypassing others until they withered in place. By mid-1944, the pace of this advance had accelerated. The capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam marked a turning point. For the first time, American bombers could strike the Japanese mainland directly. Massive B-29 superfortresses began lifting off from newly built airfields, flying missions that stretched the limits of range, navigation, and human endurance. Japan felt the pressure immediately. Cities burned under incendiary raids. Industrial capacity eroded. Yet the bombing campaign faced serious challenges. Fighter escorts could not accompany bombers all the way from the Marianas. Aircraft damaged over Japan often had nowhere to land on the return journey. Crews bailed out into the ocean or disappeared entirely. Each mission carried a silent arithmetic of loss. Between the Marianas and Japan lay a small volcanic island in the Bonin chain, barely 8 square miles in size. Its name was Iwo Jima. To Japanese planners, Iwo Jima was a shield. Radar stations on the island provided early warning of incoming bombing raids. Fighters based there could intercept American bombers long before they reached the home islands. To American planners, it was the opposite, a knife pointed at the bomber routes. If taken, Iwo Jima could serve as an emergency landing field, a base for fighter escorts, and a platform to choke off Japan's remaining defensive reach. The logic was cold, strategic, and ruthless. Iwo Jima sat directly astride the air corridor between the Marianas and Japan. As long as it remained in Japanese hands, every bombing mission would bleed air crews. If it fell, the balance would shift again, this time decisively. By late 1944, Allied leadership was already thinking beyond airfields. Okinawa lay ahead, then possibly the invasion of Japan itself. Casualty projections for such an invasion ran into the hundreds of thousands. Every operation now was weighed against the question no one could answer: how many lives would it cost to end the war? Iwo Jima became part of that calculation. Unlike earlier targets, this island would not be bypassed. Its position was too central, its utility too dangerous. American planners knew the cost would be high, but believed the long-term savings in pilots, aircraft, and momentum would justify the sacrifice. Across the Pacific, Japanese leaders reached a parallel conclusion. They could no longer stop the American advance outright, but they could make it so costly that the enemy might hesitate before striking the home islands. If one small island could drain American blood and resolve, perhaps it could buy time or force a negotiated end. Iwo Jima was chosen for that purpose. The island's isolation meant reinforcement was nearly impossible. Whatever garrison defended it would likely fight alone, with no expectation of relief. That reality shaped everything that followed. For both sides, Iwo Jima ceased to be a place on a map. It became a test case, a proving ground for endurance, a brutal experiment in how much punishment men could absorb and still advance. As invasion plans moved forward, assumptions hardened. American commanders expected fierce resistance, but believed overwhelming firepower and experience would carry the day. Japanese commanders accepted that they would probably lose the island, but intended to extract a price so high that it would echo beyond its shores. The stage was set. Ships assembled, troops trained, ammunition stockpiled, and on a volcanic island that most of the world had never heard of, defenses were being prepared with a patience born of certainty. The war was coming to Iwo Jima. But first, the island itself had to be understood.
Iwo Jima was not shaped for war, yet it would define one. The island lay isolated in the western Pacific, roughly halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese mainland. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, no fresh water, no trees, no natural harbors. From the air, it looked barren and exposed, an unpromising battlefield that seemed to offer little protection to anyone forced to defend it. That impression was dangerously misleading. Iwo Jima's surface told only part of the story. Beneath it lay a different world. The island was honeycombed with tunnels carved through soft volcanic ash and hardened rock. Caverns linked command posts to firing positions. Underground routes allowed defenders to move unseen, reoccupy positions thought destroyed, and survive bombardments that would have annihilated surface defenses. At the southern end rose Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano dominating the landing beaches. From its slopes and interior, defenders could observe and strike nearly every approach to the shore. To the north stretched a plateau of broken ridges, gullies, and jagged terrain, ideal ground for defense in depth. This landscape was shaped deliberately by the man in command of the island's defense. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi understood something his predecessors often had not. Charging beaches in suicidal counterattacks wasted lives without stopping the enemy. He rejected the traditional doctrine of contesting the landing at the waterline. Instead, he ordered his men to let the Americans come ashore, let them crowd the beaches, let them believe briefly that the bombardment had worked. Only then would the island strike back. Kuribayashi's plan was built around attrition. Every Marine who landed was to be drawn deeper into a killing ground of overlapping fire. Positions were constructed not for glory, but for longevity. Machine guns were hidden, not exposed. Artillery was buried, not paraded. Each bunker was positioned to support another, creating fields of fire that punished movement and rewarded patience. There would be no surrender, no mass charges, no symbolic last stands. The goal was not to hold territory, but to consume time, strength, and morale. By the time the invasion began, roughly 21,000 Japanese soldiers manned Iwo Jima. They knew reinforcement was unlikely. They knew evacuation was impossible. Kuribayashi made this clear from the beginning. Their duty was not survival, it was resistance measured in weeks, not hours. On the American side, planning reflected a different confidence. The operation to seize Iwo Jima, codenamed Operation Detachment, was assigned to the U.S. Marine Corps, supported by overwhelming naval and air power. The island would be softened by one of the longest pre-invasion bombardments of the Pacific War. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would pound it day and night. Carrier aircraft would strike repeatedly. Many believed little would survive such punishment. Experience, however, had already begun to erode that optimism. At Tarawa, Peleliu, and Saipan, Japanese defenders had endured intense bombardments and emerged to fight with lethal effectiveness. Still, the sheer scale of fire planned for Iwo Jima was unprecedented. The belief persisted that resistance, though fierce, would collapse quickly. Timelines were drawn, objectives were marked. The island was expected to fall within days. Marines trained relentlessly for amphibious assault, but nothing could truly prepare them for volcanic sand that trapped movement, or for an enemy that refused to reveal itself until the moment was most lethal. Maps could show ridgelines and elevations, but they could not convey the suffocating heat, the sulfur fumes, or the psychological pressure of fighting an invisible opponent. Both sides entered the battle with certainty, but of different kinds. The Americans were certain that superior firepower, discipline, and momentum would prevail. The Japanese were certain they would not survive, but that their resistance would matter. Between those convictions lay an island that would absorb both. As dawn approached on February 19, 1945, the final preparations were complete. Landing craft formed up offshore. Naval guns stood ready. Beneath the ground, Japanese defenders waited in silence, weapons loaded, tunnels sealed. Nothing more could be planned, nothing more could be rehearsed. When the first waves reached the black sand, every assumption, on both sides, would be tested at once. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima were not strangers to combat. Many had already fought across the Pacific. Yet nothing they had seen prepared them for the first minutes on the black sand. The beach offered no shelter. The volcanic ash shifted underfoot, turning every step into labor. Men sank as they ran. Others fell and struggled to rise beneath the weight of their gear. Rifles clogged with grit. Radios failed. Stretchers disappeared into the sand as medics tried to reach the wounded. Fear moved quietly among them, controlled but present. It showed in clenched jaws, in the way men hugged the ground instinctively, even before the fire intensified. When the Japanese guns finally opened up, the beach became a trap. There was nowhere to go but forward, toward terrain that was killing them. Units mixed together. Orders were shouted, lost, repeated. NCOs took charge when officers fell. Marines advanced in short rushes, dragging wounded comrades out of fire when they could, leaving others when they could not. Decisions were made in seconds and remembered for lifetimes. What sustained them was not abstraction, no grand vision of victory. It was proximity, the man beside them, the instinct not to abandon someone sharing the same strip of sand. In this way, the human battle for Iwo Jima began not as a coordinated assault, but as thousands of individual acts of movement. Amphibious doctrine was built on momentum. Hit the beach hard, push inland quickly, secure high ground before defenders could reorganize. On Iwo Jima, that logic unraveled almost immediately. The Japanese had deliberately chosen not to contest the landing at the waterline. The Marines encountered little resistance in the first moments ashore. This absence of fire created a dangerous illusion that the bombardment had succeeded. In reality, it was part of the defense. Once the beaches were congested, Kuribayashi's guns opened in coordinated bursts. Fire came not from the front, but from the flanks and rear. Hidden positions on Mount Suribachi and in the northern ridges enfiladed the landing zones. Artillery was pre-sighted. Mortars landed with precision. Movement became nearly impossible. Tanks bogged down in sand or were destroyed by concealed anti-tank weapons. Naval gunfire, so effective against surface targets, struggled to neutralize bunkers buried deep into volcanic rock. Each strong point had to be reduced manually by infantry at close range. The battle did not move quickly. Progress slowed almost at once. There were no fast advances across the island. Marines fought for small distances, sometimes only a few yards at a time. There were no natural breakthroughs. Every opening had to be created by hand. Bunkers were cleared with flamethrowers. Defenses were destroyed with explosives. Many fights happened at very close range, where Marines had to expose themselves to enemy fire. On Iwo Jima, combat did not flow smoothly. It was slow, heavy, and exhausting. Every step forward demanded time, strength, and lives. Iwo Jima was a collision between modern weapons and ancient terrain. American firepower was immense. Battleships hurled shells weighing more than a ton. Carrier aircraft dropped bombs in precise patterns. Tanks brought direct fire to the front lines. Flamethrowers, feared and hated by both sides, became essential tools for clearing bunkers and tunnels. Yet the island absorbed punishment in ways few places could. Volcanic ash muffled explosions. Hardened rock deflected blast waves. Underground chambers allowed defenders to survive bombardments that would have annihilated surface fortifications elsewhere. Japanese engineers had exploited this geology ruthlessly. Firing ports were small and well camouflaged. Artillery pieces were mounted on rails, rolled out to fire, then pulled back into safety. Tunnel networks allowed defenders to reappear behind advancing Marines, forcing repeated clearances of the same ground. Technology did not guarantee dominance here. It only shortened the distance at which killing occurred. Flamethrowers had to be carried within meters of enemy positions. Satchel charges required hands-on placement. Each bunker destroyed revealed another beyond it. Iwo Jima demonstrated a brutal truth of warfare. Superiority in weapons does not eliminate struggle. It reshapes it, often into something closer, slower, and more personal. But weapons and tactics alone could not sustain a fight measured in weeks. That burden fell on leadership, belief, and the enemy's own resolve.
Leadership on Iwo Jima was exercised under conditions that stripped command to its essentials. There were no sweeping maneuvers, no dramatic breakthroughs to exploit. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes in feet. In this environment, leadership was less about vision and more about endurance. Marine officers and non-commissioned officers led from the front because they had little choice. Radio communications were unreliable. Units were intermingled. Maps quickly became outdated as terrain was blasted into new shapes. Decisions had to be made where the fighting was thickest, often within sight of the enemy. Casualties among leaders were heavy. Platoons and companies frequently found themselves commanded by the next senior Marine still standing. Authority passed quickly, sometimes several times in a single day. Those who stepped into command did so without ceremony. They gave orders, adjusted fire, and kept men moving forward because hesitation meant death. Leadership here was not about inspiring speeches, it was about presence, standing up under fire, pointing the way forward, absorbing fear without letting it spread. Marines followed leaders who advanced, even when the advance seemed pointless, because movement itself was survival. On Iwo Jima, command was not centralized, it fractured and reformed constantly at the smallest levels. The battle was carried forward by lieutenants, sergeants, and corporals whose names would never appear in reports, but whose decisions shaped every inch gained.
The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima did not fight for ground in the conventional sense. They fought for time. Kuribayashi's strategy rejected spectacle. There were no banzai charges, no massed assaults meant to shock the enemy. Such actions, he believed, wasted lives without altering outcomes. Instead, he ordered his men to remain hidden, to fire only when targets were exposed, and to withdraw through tunnels rather than die in place. This discipline created a unique kind of terror. Marines rarely saw the enemy before being fired upon. Positions thought neutralized suddenly came alive again. A bunker destroyed in the morning could be occupied by afternoon. Progress felt temporary, uncertain, and fragile. Japanese soldiers fought knowing they would not leave the island. Letters sent before the battle spoke of duty fulfilled, not victory anticipated. This acceptance removed the incentive to retreat or surrender. Resistance continued even when positions were isolated, cut off, and doomed. Yet this was not fanaticism for its own sake. It was calculated. Every delay imposed casualties. Every forced clearance slowed the American timetable. Kuribayashi intended Iwo Jima to serve as a warning, proof that the closer the Allies came to Japan, the harder the resistance would become. For the Marines facing this enemy, the psychological burden was immense. They were not defeating an army in motion. They were dismantling a system designed to consume them, piece by piece. By the second week of fighting, illusions had disappeared on both sides. For the Americans, the belief that superior firepower would bring quick victory was gone. Each ridge taken revealed another. Each night brought infiltration, snipers, and sudden explosions from positions believed secure. Sleep was scarce, exhaustion accumulated, survival became procedural rather than hopeful. For the Japanese defenders, the absence of reinforcement confirmed what they already knew. They were fighting not for rescue, but for effect. Their endurance was measured in days held, casualties inflicted, pressure applied. Even as positions collapsed, resistance continued from isolated tunnels and hidden chambers. Morally, Iwo Jima stripped the war of narrative simplicity. Courage existed everywhere, but so did futility. Heroism did not always lead to progress. Sacrifice did not always bring resolution. Men fought because stopping was not an option available to them. Psychologically, the battle compressed time. Days blurred together. The island felt endless despite its size. Marines stopped thinking in terms of the war's end and focused instead on the next bunker, the next slope, the next night. Iwo Jima revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare, that victory can demand sustained suffering long after the outcome is no longer in doubt. It was not a question of whether the island would fall, but how much would be spent to make it fall. All of these forces, human, tactical, technological, and psychological, converged toward a single violent turning point when the battle's character was fully revealed. February 19th, 1945, 08:59 hours. The first wave of Marines reached the beaches of Iwo Jima almost exactly on schedule. From offshore, it looked orderly. Landing craft approached in disciplined lines. Naval guns lifted their fire inland. Carrier aircraft peeled away. For a brief, deceptive moment, the landing appeared to be succeeding. The beach was quiet. Marines poured out of the boats and moved inland with urgency, expecting resistance at the water's edge. Instead, they found only sand, soft, black, and unstable. The volcanic ash swallowed boots and tracked vehicles alike. Movement slowed immediately. Men stumbled, equipment dragged. The beach began to clog with bodies, gear, tanks, and supplies. Then the silence ended. Japanese guns opened almost simultaneously from multiple directions. Fire did not come straight ahead, but from concealed positions along Mount Suribachi and from the ridges to the north. Machine guns swept laterally across the beach. Mortars fell with lethal accuracy. Artillery rounds punched into the sand, throwing fragments and bodies into the air. The landing zone became a killing ground. Marines dropped instinctively, but the ground offered no protection. There were no trenches, no dunes, no vegetation. The black sand absorbed blast, but provided no cover. Men hugged the earth and were hit anyway. Others stood and ran, because movement, however dangerous, was the only alternative to certain death. Officers tried to restore order. Platoons dissolved into mixed groups. Radios failed or were destroyed. Tanks that reached shore bogged down or were knocked out by hidden anti-tank fire. Naval gunfire attempted to suppress enemy positions, but many bunkers were too deeply buried to be neutralized. Within hours, casualty stations overflowed. Medics worked in the open, exposed to fire as they treated the wounded. Stretchers disappeared into the sand. Wounded men lay where they fell, waiting for darkness or rescue that might never come. Despite the chaos, Marines continued to push forward. Small groups advanced in short rushes, diving behind shell craters or the wreckage of destroyed vehicles. Flamethrowers were brought up at great risk, their operators prime targets. Explosives were carried forward by hand. Every yard gained was contested. By midday, it was clear that the assumptions underlying the invasion had failed. The bombardment had not broken the defense. The enemy was not disorganized. The island was not collapsing. Instead, it was fighting back with a methodical brutality that punished every movement. Mount Suribachi loomed over the southern beaches, its slopes riddled with firing positions that had survived days of shelling. To the north, the terrain rose into a maze of ridges and ravines that offered defenders endless opportunities for ambush. Yet the Marines did not withdraw. Withdrawal was not an option built into the plan, nor to the mindset of the man on the beach. Reinforcements continued to land under fire. Supplies piled up. The invasion pressed forward because stopping would only concentrate losses without reducing them. By nightfall, the Americans had established a tenuous foothold inland. It was shallow, irregular, and constantly under threat, but it existed. The cost had been staggering. Thousands were dead or wounded in a single day. The beaches were littered with wreckage and bodies. Still, the island had not broken the Marines. Instead, it had revealed its true character. Iwo Jima was not a battle that would be decided by a single blow. It would be decided by sustained pressure, by relentless clearance of one position after another, and by the willingness to endure losses without the reassurance of rapid progress. As darkness fell, Japanese defenders emerged through tunnels to harass positions, probe lines, and remind the invaders that the island was far from subdued. Sleep was impossible. Fear settled into routine. The first day had answered one question decisively. This would be one of the bloodiest battles the Marine Corps had ever fought. But the battle's center of gravity had not yet been reached. That moment lay ahead, on the slopes of Suribachi and across the northern plateau, where endurance would be tested not for hours, but for weeks. The struggle was about to intensify, and the cost was about to rise even higher. In the days that followed the landing, the battle for Iwo Jima narrowed into two distinct struggles. One was vertical, the other was relentless. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern end of the island like a watchful presence. Its slopes were steep, exposed, and honeycombed with defenses that had survived bombardment almost intact. Every approach route was covered, every advance was visible. To leave Suribachi in enemy hands was to allow constant fire onto the beaches and supply routes below. It had to be taken. Marine units moved deliberately, advancing yard by yard up the volcano's flanks. Flamethrowers led assaults, their operators protected by riflemen who understood that losing the weapon meant losing momentum. Satchel charges were thrown into cave mouths, grenades followed. Smoke drifted constantly, mingling with sulfur fumes rising from the ground itself. The Japanese defenders fought invisibly. A position that seemed silent would erupt in fire the moment Marines crossed open ground. When a bunker was finally destroyed, the enemy often withdrew through tunnels rather than dying in place. Marines learned quickly that clearing Suribachi was not a single action, but a process, repeated again and again under unbroken pressure. By February 23rd, after days of brutal fighting, Marines reached the summit. A small flag was raised briefly, then replaced later by a larger one. The moment was photographed and would become iconic, but on the ground it did not feel decisive. There was no pause, no celebration. The battle continued below, where the real weight of the island still waited. North of Suribachi, the terrain hardened into a nightmare of ridges and ravines, with names Marines would never forget. Positions were taken, lost, and retaken. Each ridge became its own battle, each gully its own trap. The Japanese defense in depth revealed its full design here, forcing Marines to clear the same ground multiple times as defenders re-emerged behind them. Attrition defined the tempo. Units rotated not because objectives were completed, but because casualties made continuation impossible. Fresh Marines stepped into ground still warm from fighting, inheriting positions measured in shell holes rather than lines. Leadership turnover accelerated. The burden of command shifted downward, often without warning.
Night offered no relief. Japanese soldiers infiltrated American lines, attacking from tunnels that bypassed forward positions entirely. Grenades exploded in foxholes, shots rang out in darkness. Marines slept in fragments, weapons always within reach. Fatigue blurred judgment. Fear became constant, but manageable only because it was shared. The advance continued regardless. Bunkers were reduced one by one. Flamethrowers burned until fuel ran out. Explosives collapsed tunnel entrances. Artillery was dragged forward to fire at near direct range. The island was dismantled through persistence rather than maneuver. As days stretched into weeks, the question was no longer whether the Marines could take Iwo Jima. It was how much of themselves they would lose in the process. The Japanese defenders, though steadily reduced, continued to fight from isolated pockets, determined to extract a final cost. By early March, organized resistance began to fracture. Positions fell more quickly. Fire slackened in some sectors. Yet even then, isolated defenders continued to emerge unexpectedly, prolonging danger and uncertainty. Victory, when it came, did not arrive with clarity. It crept forward, uneven and incomplete. On March 26th, after more than a month of continuous fighting, Iwo Jima was declared secure. The declaration did not mean silence. Sporadic fighting continued for days. Hidden defenders remained underground, emerging only when discovered or destroyed. The island resisted even in defeat. For the Marines who survived, the end felt less like triumph than release. They had endured a battle without illusion, one that demanded everything and offered no reassurance until it was finished. The cost was visible everywhere, on the ground, in the ranks, in the empty spaces where men had stood weeks earlier. The climax of Iwo Jima was not a single moment, but an accumulation. It was the slow realization that endurance itself had become the decisive weapon. That realization carried consequences far beyond the island. What followed would reveal whether the sacrifice had achieved what strategy demanded, and what it had cost to do so.
When the fighting on Iwo Jima finally subsided, the island bore little resemblance to the place the Marines had landed on 5 weeks earlier. The volcanic landscape had been reshaped by shell fire and explosives. Ridges were flattened, gullies deepened. What had once been a barren island was now a scarred expanse of craters, shattered bunkers, and collapsed tunnels. The human cost was staggering. Of the roughly 70,000 U.S. Marines and Navy personnel who took part in the operation, more than 26,000 became casualties. Nearly 7,000 were killed. For the Marine Corps, Iwo Jima represented the highest casualty rate of any single battle in its history. Entire units were depleted. Companies that had landed together no longer resembled themselves by the end. Japanese losses were even more severe. Of approximately 21,000 defenders, almost all were killed. Only a few hundred were taken prisoner, many of them wounded or unconscious when captured. Kuribayashi's strategy of defense in depth had succeeded in its purpose, to delay, to bleed, to impose cost, but it had also ensured near total destruction of the garrison. Control of the island came not with fanfare, but with exhaustion. Marines occupied positions that had once fired upon them, often without fully knowing what lay beneath their feet. Tunnel networks extended for miles. Some defenders remained hidden long after the island was declared secure, emerging sporadically in acts of desperation or final resistance. Even in victory, danger persisted. Clearing operations continued. Engineers sealed tunnels. Patrols moved cautiously, aware that the island had not yet relinquished all its defenders. Iwo Jima resisted being finished. Yet, from a military perspective, control was absolute. Airfields damaged during the battle were repaired rapidly. Within days, American aircraft began using the island operationally. Fighters escorted bombers. Damaged planes diverted safely to Iwo Jima rather than ditching at sea. For air crews flying to and from Japan, the island became a lifeline. These early landings gave tangible meaning to the sacrifice. Each aircraft that touched down represented crews saved, missions completed, and pressure sustained against Japan's remaining defenses. Over time, thousands of B-29 bombers would land on Iwo Jima, many carrying crews who would not have survived the journey otherwise. For the Marines who had fought there, however, such strategic calculations felt distant. What remained immediate were the absences, the empty places in formations, the silence where familiar voices had been. Victory was measured less in objectives achieved than in survival itself. Iwo Jima had been taken, but it had demanded payment in lives that could never be repaid. The question that lingered was not whether the island had been worth taking in purely tactical terms, but how its cost would shape the decisions yet to come. The battle's consequences would extend beyond casualty lists and airfield statistics. They would influence how leaders thought about the next steps of the war and about the limits of endurance on both sides. Those implications would soon be felt far beyond the black sand as the war moved closer still to Japan's shores. As the dust settled over Iwo Jima, its significance began to register far beyond the island itself. What had been 8 square miles of volcanic rock was now firmly in American hands, and almost immediately it was folded into the larger machinery of the war against Japan. The airfields that had justified the invasion were brought online with remarkable speed. Engineers worked amid unexploded ordnance and lingering danger, repairing runways damaged by weeks of shelling. Within days, fighter aircraft were operating from Iwo Jima. Soon after, damaged B-29 bombers began landing there in increasing numbers. Over the remainder of the war, thousands of American airmen owed their lives to that strip of land carved out of fire and ash. From a purely operational standpoint, Iwo Jima worked. Bomber losses declined. Fighter escorts extended their reach. The bombing campaign against Japan intensified with fewer interruptions. In reports and briefings, the island became evidence that the cost, however high, had produced measurable results. Yet the battle's deeper impact was psychological. For American leadership, Iwo Jima was a warning. If an isolated island with no hope of reinforcement could impose such casualties, what would happen on Okinawa, and beyond that, on the Japanese home islands themselves? Intelligence estimates already predicted fanatical resistance. Iwo Jima turned those predictions into lived reality. The next major operation, Okinawa, would confirm those fears on an even larger scale. Casualty projections for a potential invasion of Japan were revised upward again and again. Military planners, politicians, and scientists all absorbed the lesson Iwo Jima had delivered. Japan would not collapse easily, and every mile closer would be paid for in blood. For Japan, the battle reinforced a grim truth. Even the most prepared defenses, even total commitment, could not stop the Allied advance. Kuribayashi's strategy had delayed the Americans and inflicted enormous losses, but it had not altered the outcome. The island fell, the bombers kept coming, the war closed in regardless. Among Japanese civilians and soldiers alike, the battle became part of a growing realization that defeat was no longer hypothetical. Resistance could be heroic, it could be devastating, but it could not reverse the tide.
Iwo Jima also reshaped how the war was remembered. Images from the battle, particularly the flag raising on Suribachi, became symbols of sacrifice and resolve. Yet for those who fought there, such symbols never fully captured the experience. What stayed with them were the sounds, the exhaustion, and the sense of being consumed by a place that demanded everything and offered nothing in return. In official histories, Iwo Jima was often framed as necessary, costly, and successful. All three were true. But the battle also represented something harder to quantify: the point at which the human cost of ending the war became impossible to ignore. The island had done what Kuribayashi intended. It had shown unmistakably how high the price of invasion would be. That message would weigh heavily on every decision that followed, shaping the final months of the Pacific War in ways that extended far beyond its shores. And when the guns finally fell silent, Iwo Jima would remain, not just as a battlefield, but as a question history has never fully answered. Iwo Jima does not offer easy conclusions. The island is quiet now. The black sand still shifts underfoot. Mount Suribachi rises unchanged against the sky. Wind moves across ground once torn apart by artillery and fire. There are no front lines left to cross, no orders left to follow, only the weight of what happened here. For the United States, Iwo Jima became proof of endurance, not of brilliance or speed, but of the capacity to persist when progress disappeared and losses mounted. The Marines who fought there did not win because the battle became easier. They won because they continued when it did not. Their achievement lies not in symbols raised or territory gained, but in the human ability to keep moving forward under conditions designed to break that ability. For Japan, the battle stands as a testament to a different kind of resolve, one shaped by certainty of defeat and commitment to resistance, regardless of outcome. Kuribayashi's defense did not save Iwo Jima, but it did succeed in forcing the world to confront the cost of ending the war. In that sense, the island became a message written in lives rather than words. Historically, Iwo Jima sits at a crossroads. It did not end the war. It did not prevent what came next, but it changed how leaders thought about invasion, sacrifice, and the limits of human endurance. The shadow it cast stretched forward to Okinawa, to the debates over invasion, and to decisions that would define the war's final chapter. What makes Iwo Jima endure is not just what was achieved there, but what was revealed: that modern warfare can demand everything from individuals while offering no certainty in return. That courage exists on all sides, even when causes and outcomes diverge. And that victory, when purchased at such cost, is never uncomplicated. Today, Iwo Jima is remembered in stone, in photographs, and in ceremony. But its deepest legacy is quieter. It lives in the unanswered question it leaves behind, one that history continues to carry forward. How much is enough? And how much is too much to ask of those sent to fight?